The core belief of Christianity is that Jesus died and was resurrected from the dead, and through his sacrifice we can all obtain salvation. But are there good reasons to accept this as a fact of history, or is it just a production of blind faith? It is my intention to provide an adequate historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. In this video, I will argue for 6 facts regarding Jesus' passion narrative that I believe inevitably lead to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus' death by crucifixion is perhaps the most widely accepted fact about Jesus' life. Dr. Mike Licona lists the crucifixion as a bedrock fact of history. Historical bedrock is what is reached when a hypothesis is so unanimously agreed upon by historians and scholars that subject of the field must adequately account for it. On a personal note, I am unaware of any scholars that reject Jesus' crucifixion, aside from Muslims and Jesus mythicists. But is this really all that surprising? Muslims do so on grounds of their faith in the Quran, which says Jesus wasn't really crucified. Therefore, if they did accept the crucifixion of Jesus, then they wouldn't be Muslims at all. As far as Jesus mythicists go, they don't believe Jesus existed in the first place. Therefore, it is impossible that he could have been crucified, much less come back to life. I should also mention that Jesus mythicism is a fringe view among New Testament scholars. If Dr. Gary Habermas is correct, there are more scientists who believe in a young earth than there are scholars that believe Jesus never existed at all. But what sources do we have attesting to Jesus' death by crucifixion? Well, they're all 4 of the canonical Gospels, Paul's letters, the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, and the 1st century Roman historian Tacitus. It is rather uncommon to have one source attesting to something in the ancient world, yet here we have several. Even if we discount the synoptics as separate sources due to the synoptic problem, then we would still have 5 separate independent sources, which is much more than most in the ancient world can say. We should also take note of Josephus and Tacitus. These were not friends of the early church. Josephus was a devout Jew, and Tacitus was a Roman pagan, who went as far as to say that the Christians committed abominations. There's no incentive for either of these men to lie about the death of a Jewish rabbi who claimed to be the Messiah. Now, to finish this section on the crucifixion, I will conclude with a quote from skeptical New Testament scholar Dominic Crossan. Crossan states, "Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical ever can be." Jesus' burial in a tomb is estimated to be accepted by around 75% of New Testament scholars, according to Dr. Gary Habermas. Although this is the majority view, this fact is the one that typically receives the most pushback from skeptics, as it is argued that Jesus would have simply been thrown in a mass grave and not been buried in a tomb. But this has several problems. The first thing of note is that the Romans generally allowed each province to follow their own laws and customs without much interference. The 1st century Jewish philosopher Philo reports of an incident in which Pontius Pilate attempted to put Roman seals on the Jewish temple. The Jews sent a letter to the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius had the seals taken down immediately and reprimanded Pilate. All this is to show that generally the Romans didn't care much about interfering with the laws and customs of each individual province. Now, according to Jewish law, criminals had to be buried, as the Jews were very concerned with keeping the land clean. The 1st century Jewish historian Josephus states, "We must furnish fire, water, food, to all who ask for them, point out the road, not leave a corpse unburied, show consideration to even declared enemies." Another reason to think that Jesus could have been buried is because we have archaeological evidence that a crucified victim named Johannan was buried. Now, some like skeptical scholar Dominic Crossan have argued that Johannan was the exception and not the rule, and therefore Johannan's burial is probably not something that should be taken into account when judging whether or not Jesus, who was crucified, would have been given a proper burial. Dr. Jodi Magness responds to Dr. Crossan's arguments with 3 points. The first point is that there has only ever been one undisturbed tomb in Jerusalem ever discovered, and therefore it is unsurprising that we don't have many examples of crucified victims being buried. The second point is that most tombs would have belonged to the wealthy elite who could use their money, power, and/or influence to avoid crucifixion altogether. The third and final point is that the nail in Johannan's heel was simply a fluke, as typically the means by which the victims were affixed to the cross would leave no discernible trace in the remains that we have. But the fact that Johannan is the only crucified victim that we have observed receiving a proper burial isn't something that should be written off as one exception, but seen as a miracle in of itself, considering all the conditions that should have made it impossible for us to know whether or not it actually happened. The next point on why the burial in a tomb is probably historical is the fact that it is one of the only things attested in all 4 of the Gospels. Each Gospel will sort of pick and choose which stories of Jesus they want to write about, and a story that appears in John's Gospel, like, say, Nicodemus, may not appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. But the burial in a tomb is one of the only things attested in all the Gospels across the board, without a single exception. Typically in ancient history, we are very lucky to have 2 sources on an event. but here we have 4. Should also be noted that if they were crafting their narrative based on Old Testament prophecy, like many skeptics would suspect, then they would have probably embraced the burial in a mass grave on fulfillment of Isaiah 53:9. In summary, the Romans typically allowed each individual province to follow their own laws. Jewish law would have required Jesus to be buried. We have archaeological evidence that a crucified victim could be buried. It is multiply attested, and they would have embraced a mass grave on the basis of predictive prophecy. Jesus' postmortem appearances may be something that you would expect to witness a lot of disagreement on among scholars, but as it turns out, it is one of the few things that is agreed upon by a unanimous amount of New Testament scholars. The postmortem appearances are the second fact which are considered historical bedrock. But what are our sources on the event anyways? Well, Jesus is reported to have appeared in all 4 of the canonical Gospels, the book of Acts, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, some of the non-canonical Christian texts, and even a passage in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews reports this event. Josephus attests to the death, miracles, resurrection, and even the messiahship of Christ. Now, many scholars believe this passage was interpolated by a later scribe because Josephus was a devout Jew, and had he considered Jesus the Messiah, well, then he would have been a Christian, which he obviously wasn't. And it is indeed true that this passage was most likely a late interpolation, but that does not mean it is just wholesale fiction, as even very skeptical scholars wouldn't say that much. There is indeed an Arabic manuscript, which we have found, which, instead of saying Josephus believed these things, says that Jesus' followers claimed that he appeared to them and was the Messiah, which makes more sense given our historical context. With that being said, we have an early, 1st century, non-Christian text telling us that this thing was being said. I mentioned earlier that Jesus' postmortem appearances are also reported in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. The passage in question is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 7. This passage is of the utmost importance because it is the earliest information we have on Jesus in history, period. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7, Paul preserves an early creed which he had received from others. This creed is dated very early, and scholar Gerald O Collins states that he is unaware of any scholar who places the creed after the mid-40s. Now, many scholars even suggest that this creed goes back to within months after Jesus' death. We can date the creed early because Paul is the one who received it and is now passing it on. Paul became a Christian around 3 years after the death of Jesus. Another 3 years after his conversion, Paul claims that he went to visit Peter. Now, this is pretty interesting because the Greek word translated to visited in Galatians 1:18 is histori, which means to inquire about or receive information from. If Paul went to Peter for the purpose of learning information about Jesus, it is very likely that this is when he received the creed. So, based on the information we have available, it seems very likely that less than a decade after Jesus had died, reports of his resurrection were already in circulation and had been reported by his followers, including Peter, who was an eyewitness who would have given Paul this creed in the first place. Now, I want to focus on something that is very important, but also something I haven't said much about so far. That being, what does this early creed even say about Jesus? This creed is by far the earliest information we have on anything regarding Jesus, so it can be a very useful tool when giving us insight into what was initially said about Jesus. Well, the creed says, as you can see, that Jesus died, was buried, resurrected, appeared to Peter, the disciples, apostles, and James. Contrary to popular biblical criticism, the earlier you look into the historical records of Jesus, you won't find a completely different story that is against the entire Bible, but the same one that has always been told. Now, I will remind you that even the most skeptical scholars will accept this as a fact of history, with a quote from E.P. Sanders. Sanders states, "It is an equally secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him. What sense is not certain, after his death. Thereafter his followers saw him." The fourth fact we will take a look at is the martyrdom of Jesus' followers. The martyrdom of these individuals is very important for establishing their genuineness when proclaiming the resurrection of Christ. While various sources speak of various individuals partaking and being victims of persecution, Tacitus reports of the general persecution of the Christians under Emperor Nero. The martyrs make it extraordinarily unlikely that these people were simply making this up on the fly. Now, I will make it clear that some Christians do tend to overstate the case when it comes to the death of the apostles. Personally, I was told that all 12, with the exception of John, died a martyr's death. The fact of the matter is, many of the stories in which we find these deaths come much, much later, with many containing teachings that any devout Christian today would wholeheartedly reject. With that being said, who are our candidates for martyrdom anyways? Well, there are 4 people who most likely did indeed die for their faith in Christ, these 4 being Peter, Paul, James the son of Zebedee, and James the brother of Jesus. Now, what are the historical sources pertaining to the deaths? Well, you may be surprised, but the New Testament barely talks about the deaths of the 12, or many of the early Christians for that matter. I was actually rather surprised that there were no stories of the disciples marching to their deaths confidently with faith in Christ. The New Testament speaks only of one, although possibly two, deaths of the 12. The primary death that we will be talking about here is James the son of Zebedee, who is recorded to have died in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 to 5. Here, Herod kills James and soon after imprisons Peter. Some skeptics have suggested that the death of James wasn't influenced by his beliefs in Christianity and is therefore irrelevant when trying to find out the truth of his claim in Christ's resurrection. I find this to be a weak response on part of the skeptic. Herod kills James, and when he sees that it pleases the Jews, he then imprisons Peter. It is very obvious that Herod is trying to please the Jews, and these were the primary enemies to early Christianity. Now that we are done with this James, I will speak of the other. James, the brother of Jesus, is an interesting one in my opinion. His death wasn't mentioned in the New Testament and isn't mentioned by the early church fathers or leaders. Instead, our primary ancient source regarding the death of James, the brother of Jesus, is Josephus. Josephus reports the death of James around the end of the 1st century in his work Antiquities of the Jews. Similar to the other James, attempts to soften the importance of this death have been made. Some will argue that James's death was a result of a political crime, not faith in Christ. But as stated with the previous James, this also doesn't seem very likely. James is said to have been killed by Annas, who was the Jewish high priest, on account of breaking the law. But what law would an anti-Christian Jewish high priest have been concerned about? Well, that is rather obvious. The Jewish law. I find it extraordinarily unlikely that the high priest of the Jews just happened to have killed James, a leading member of the early church, on grounds that were not related to Judaism or Christianity. I will now address the final two, those being Peter and Paul. The deaths of these two is mentioned in 1st Clement, which is the earliest Christian writing outside of the New Testament, dating to around the end of the 1st century. Besides this, there very well may be another 1st century reference to the death of Peter, in John chapter 21 verses 8 to 19. Jesus predicts the death of Peter. Even evangelical conservative scholars will date John to around 90 AD. This would be multiple decades after Peter's death, meaning that even if we as Christians grant the skeptics' objection saying that John just fabricated this and put these words in Peter's mouth, it would only be put in Jesus' mouth if it had actually happened. Once again, skeptics will try to diminish the relevance of Peter's death here. It has been suggested that what is described in John 21:18 to 19 is Peter growing old in a sort of nursing home. While this is an already peculiar interpretation, this theory becomes even more unlikely when it says that Peter's death would glorify God. Peter growing old in an old folks' home doesn't seem to be something that would be all that glorifying to God, and just seems like a random generic death. Now, the final fact that we will go over is the conversion of skeptics, specifically Paul and James. Paul's conversion from vicious persecutor of the church to the spokesman is the third and final fact of historical bedrock. There is virtually no disagreement about Paul's previous role as an early church persecutor who wanted to hunt down the Christians and get rid of them entirely. Similarly, there seems to be little pushback to the notion that James did not accept Jesus as the Messiah prior to the death and subsequent resurrection of Christ. Many scholars realize that the leader of the Jerusalem church, James, would not have been falsely proclaimed to be an early skeptic. It would have been doing little help to the Christian movement, but instead only hurt James's reputation, but also Jesus, who would have been rejected by his own family. Yet, this is what we see without exception throughout the Gospels. Now, I hope I have provided an adequate case for the resurrection thus far. I will be making a part 2 and possibly more parts to this, just seeing how it goes. With that being said, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like the video. If you have something to say, feel free to comment. And if you want to see more of my content, always subscribe, as I have a lot of plans for the future. Thank you for watching.